What's up, nerds? Mike here. In this video, we're going to take a very brief look at the Federation architecture. Now, I don't want to go too in the weeds just yet in this video. I just want to get you familiar with some new terminology and that sort of thing. And then in the next few videos, we'll gradually start to get more technical. I'll show you some CLI demos and that sort of thing. So let's get to it. So in the last video, I showed you guys a slide that was very similar to this. I've changed this one a little bit. So in this case, we have 3 physical data centers. We have San Francisco, Reno, and we have Los Angeles. Now in the previous slide I showed you guys, I had this as an icon. So each of these had kind of this icon at each site. So in this case, I'm introducing a new piece of terminology here, and that is called the local manager. What is a local manager? It's just your regular NSX-T manager cluster. It's 3 NSX-T managers deployed as OVAs, just like we did in my 3.0 from scratch series. But the reason we call it a local manager is because we're going to have another piece to this, and that's called the global manager. And the global manager will ultimately connect to each of those local manager clusters at each site. And then by having that global manager as kind of that overarching umbrella to our environment, we can do things like, say, I want these security policies or groups to be extended across sites. I can create overlay networks and I can stretch them between multiple sites or all of my sites or just some of my sites, whatever the case is. And don't worry, we will get into the details on how the global manager works, how the local manager works, what is kind of the difference in roles and responsibilities for those components. But I want to get you familiar with this terminology. The last thing I'll mention here is that from a terminology standpoint, going forward, you'll see this lingo constantly, GM for global manager and LM for local manager. My recommendation is to program yourself to, when you hear LM, just think NSX-T manager cluster. And technically, by the way, a GM is just an NSX-T manager. In fact, if you go deploy an NSX-T manager OVA right now, in the OVA details, you can actually change the role to global manager. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little, but I just wanted to point that out. So as far as takeaways go for NSX Federation, the first thing you should know is that if we want to protect against a site failure, we would basically do that configuration from the global manager. So what does that mean? That means if I want to configure a security group, for example, that will live at multiple locations, then I would set it up in the global manager. Why is that? Well, that's because for the most part, the LMs aren't really aware of each other. They technically are, and we'll get into the details there, but let's just say if you want to protect against that site failure, set it up in the GM. One thing I'll also mention is that we still have the ability with Federation to manage each site independently. You can still do things like deploy edge nodes, you can prep your hosts, you can set up groups and T0s and T1s and segments. You can do all of that stuff like you could before. You just now have the ability to do it across multiple locations if you were to log into the GM. So let's say as an example, you had a DB seg and you wanted it to only exist at site A. You can absolutely do that, and basically you would just log into the site A local manager cluster and you would make the configuration there. In this case, you would create a DB seg and that's it, you're done. As another example, let's say you wanted a firewall policy to exist at site B, but not site A. You can also do this. You could go to site B, create that firewall policy, and site A won't even know about it. Now, I will say you could also technically do this from the global manager, and we'll get into that, but there are a few ways to kind of slice and dice this, but you do have that capability. Now, from a component standpoint, I want to mention whether we're talking LM or GM, they're all clusters essentially at the end of the day. So 3 it would make a cluster in the terms of NSX. So you have an LM cluster at site A, B, and C. That means 3 OVAs at site A, 3 at site B, and yes, 3 at site C. In terms of the global manager, there's some different deployment models you can follow, but generally speaking, the same is true. You have a cluster of 3 GMs at site A, and you could have 3 at site B, for example. But again, don't get hung up on that detail too much because we will be discussing the components and kind of how that works. And the final thing I'll mention about all of this, and you already know this if you're watching this video, is that there are routing implications when you're running NSX-T Federation. If you think about it, it makes sense. If I have a network 10.25.2.0/24 and it exists at site A and also at site B and maybe at site C as well, how does that routing work? Well, there's a lot of, that's a huge topic, so we will be getting into it at a high level in another video, but I just wanted to make you guys aware that I will be covering that, and we will actually be doing some labs for this stuff too. So that's all I have for you in this video. I know this was really short and very high level, but again, I don't want to throw you guys in the deep end because I'll be honest, when I first started looking at Federation, it was extremely complicated. So it is not that bad, I will say. Once you get familiar with the new terminology and that sort of thing, it's really not that bad. So you will get it, don't worry. Until next time, stay safe and healthy. Mike out.